On June 30th, 1908, at 7:14 in the morning, the sky over Siberia split open. A blast of energy 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima flattened 80 million trees across an area larger than a major city, an area you could fit an entire metropolitan region into, gone in less time than it takes to read this sentence. It knocked a man clean off his porch 65 kilometers away, threw grown adults to the ground, and shattered windows in towns hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, glass raining down on streets where people had no idea anything had happened at all. It was felt as far as London, registered on seismographs in Germany and barometers across 2 continents, a pressure wave that circled part of the planet before anyone even knew what had caused it. And yet, when scientists finally reached the site nearly 20 years later, they found something that made no sense at all. No crater, no meteorite, no bomb, no wreckage of any kind, not one piece of metal, not one fragment anyone could hold up and say, "This is what did it." To this day, over a century later, with modern satellites, chemical analysis, and some of the best scientific minds on the planet dedicated to the question, we still don't have a complete, universally accepted answer for what actually happened that morning in the forests of Tunguska. To understand why Tunguska remains such a mystery, you have to understand just how remote it really is. The Podkamennaya Tunguska River region sits in central Siberia, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town, in one of the most sparsely populated places on the entire planet, a landscape of endless pine forest, frozen rivers, and swamp that stretches for thousands of kilometers in every direction without a single road. In 1908, this land was home to small groups of Evenki reindeer herders, and almost no one else. There were no cities nearby, no railways, no telegraph lines running through the immediate area, and no way for word of what happened to travel quickly to anyone who might investigate. That isolation is exactly why, when the sky exploded that June morning, almost no scientific instruments were nearby to record it properly, and almost no trained observers were close enough to document what they saw in careful detail. Russia at the time was also in deep political turmoil, still reeling from the aftermath of a failed revolution in 1905, a country focused inward on unrest, strikes, and upheaval in its major cities far to the west. A massive explosion in an empty forest, thousands of kilometers from Moscow and St. Petersburg, simply wasn't a priority for a government already consumed by crisis at home. What little news of the event did travel came mostly through scattered telegraph reports from towns hundreds of kilometers away, describing a strange sky and a distant roar, filed as minor curiosities alongside far more urgent domestic news. But the people who were there described something extraordinary, accounts collected years later by expedition teams that remained remarkably consistent from witness to witness, despite the distances between them. Evenki herders spoke of a column of blue-white light, brighter than the sun, moving across the sky like a second sun rising in the wrong direction, at the wrong time of day. Some said the light seemed to split in two before the flash came, while others simply remembered being unable to look directly at it. Then, a flash so intense it seemed to burn the sky itself white for a fraction of a second. Then came heat so intense that witnesses tens of kilometers away said their shirts felt like they were burning against their skin, that their faces stung as if they were standing too close to an open furnace door. Then, seconds later, the shockwave arrived, a blast that threw grown men off their feet, shattered windows hundreds of kilometers away, knocked down wooden fences, and was picked up on sensitive barometers as far away as England, registering as a measurable pressure wave that had traveled around a significant portion of the entire globe before finally dissipating. At a trading post over 500 kilometers from the epicenter, merchants reported their shop windows rattling violently, with several panes cracking outright, while further away still, train drivers along the Trans-Siberian Railway felt their carriages shudder as if the track itself had shifted beneath them. Reindeer herds, hundreds of animals at once, were killed instantly where they stood, their bodies later found scorched and scattered across the blast zone. Tents and temporary shelters used by nomadic herders were flattened in an instant, canvas and poles reduced to splinters, and entire family groups camped closer to the epicenter were left with severe burns despite being nowhere near what anyone would normally consider ground zero. And in the immediate area closest to the blast, nothing, not a single tree, was left standing upright. Just charred, bare ground stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see, as if some enormous hand had simply wiped the forest away. Survivors who lived through it later said the silence afterward was almost worse than the noise itself, an unnatural stillness settling over a forest that, moments earlier, had been full of birdsong and the ordinary sounds of the taiga. For nearly 2 decades after the event, almost no formal scientific investigation happened at all. The event was reported briefly in a handful of regional newspapers, treated as a curiosity, then largely forgotten by the wider world, overshadowed first by the political chaos already gripping Russia, and later by the First World War, revolution, and the eventual collapse of the Russian Empire itself. It wasn't until 1927, 19 years after the blast, that a Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik led the first serious scientific expedition into the Tunguska wilderness, funded by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, who suspected the event had been caused by a giant meteorite and hoped to recover valuable iron fragments that could be studied or even sold to fund further research. The journey itself was brutal, testing the limits of Kulik's small team from the very first day. They trekked for weeks through dense taiga forest, freezing swamp, and fast-moving rivers, hauling scientific equipment on sleds and pack horses across terrain that had barely changed since prehistoric times, fighting mosquitoes, cold, and exhaustion the entire way, often covering only a few kilometers a day through the thickest sections of fallen timber. They were guided by local Evenki hunters who remained visibly reluctant to approach the site, even 19 years after the event. Some believed the region was cursed, punished by a forest god named Ogdi, who had struck down anyone foolish enough to trespass there. And it took considerable persuasion and payment to convince guides to lead the expedition all the way to the epicenter itself. When Kulik finally reached the epicenter, exhausted, half-frozen, and running low on supplies, what he found stopped him completely in his tracks. An area of roughly 2,150 square kilometers of forest lay flattened, with trees pointing outward from a central point like the spokes of a giant wheel, clear, unmistakable evidence of a massive aerial explosion, radiating outward from a single point somewhere in the sky above. But at the very center, where a crater should have been, where the meteorite itself should have struck the ground and left a deep, obvious scar in the earth, there was nothing. Just a small cluster of trees still standing upright at the epicenter, scorched black and stripped completely of their branches, but not knocked over, sitting eerily untouched in the middle of total devastation, as if whatever caused this had detonated high above the ground rather than on it. Kulik reportedly stood at that spot for a long time before saying a word to his team. The absence of a crater and the total absence of any meteorite fragments turned Tunguska from a strange natural disaster into one of the greatest unsolved scientific puzzles of the 20th century. Kulik spent years on the case, returning for multiple follow-up expeditions through the 1930s, drilling into swamp beds hoping to find buried metal fragments beneath the peat, and coming back each time with essentially nothing conclusive to show for it, despite bringing progressively more sophisticated equipment on each trip. His work was eventually interrupted entirely by the outbreak of the Second World War, and Kulik himself died in a German prisoner-of-war camp in 1942, never solving the mystery he had dedicated the better part of his career to chasing. So scientists who came after him began proposing explanations of their own, each one trying to account for the same strange, stubborn set of facts. An enormous release of energy, no crater, and no physical debris left behind anywhere. The leading theory today holds that Tunguska was caused by a stony asteroid, roughly 50 to 60 meters wide, smaller than a football field, that entered the atmosphere at extremely high speed and exploded in a massive airburst several kilometers above the ground, before it ever had the chance to reach the surface at all. That single detail would explain the total devastation without any crater. The explosion happened high in the sky, not down on the ground, releasing the energy of roughly 10 to 15 megatons of TNT outward and downward in every direction at once, like an enormous, invisible hammer striking the forest from directly above, radiating heat and pressure without ever touching the soil itself. But for decades, that explanation left frustrating gaps in the evidence, and it opened the door to far stranger theories that filled the vacuum left by an unanswered question. Some scientists proposed it was instead a fragment of a comet, made mostly of ice and loose dust, which would have vaporized almost completely on contact with the atmosphere, leaving no solid debris behind to ever find or study, a theory that gained traction partly because of unusually bright night skies reported across parts of Europe in the weeks following the blast. Others, further out on the fringe, speculated about a small black hole passing straight through the Earth and out the other side, or even, in the wilder corners of Cold War-era pseudoscience, an alien spacecraft that malfunctioned catastrophically and exploded mid-flight, an idea that found its way into popular science fiction long before serious scientists firmly dismissed it as implausible on physical grounds. None of those more exotic theories have ever held up under real scrutiny or physical evidence. But even the leading asteroid airburst theory has never been fully, definitively proven, because to this day, we've never recovered a single confirmed fragment of the object that caused it. In over a century of investigation, across dozens of expeditions using modern satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and detailed chemical soil analysis, the object responsible for the Tunguska event has never once been physically found, positively identified, or placed behind glass in a museum case anywhere in the world. Modern science has narrowed the picture considerably since Kulik's day, even without a smoking gun to point to directly. Tree ring analysis, careful soil sampling, and advanced computer modeling in the decades since have strongly supported the airburst asteroid theory, and researchers have found microscopic traces of rock and mineral material in the soil consistent with a stony space object, tiny particles completely invisible to the naked eye, but clearly detectable under laboratory analysis, using techniques that simply didn't exist in Kulik's time. In 2013, a team of Russian scientists even claimed to identify fragments in soil samples that had actually been collected decades earlier, sitting in storage the whole time, though those specific findings remain debated within the wider scientific community and haven't been universally accepted as conclusive proof. What isn't debated at all is the sheer scale of the danger that this kind of event represents. If an object of similar size entered the atmosphere today over a populated area, instead of remote Siberian wilderness, the airburst alone could level a major city and kill millions of people, with little to no advance warning whatsoever, because objects that relatively small are still extremely difficult for our telescopes to detect until they're already dangerously close to Earth, sometimes only hours before impact. Tunguska remains the single largest impact event in all of recorded human history, and it happened over one of the only places on the entire planet remote and empty enough that almost no one died as a result. A coincidence of geography and timing that, had it happened just a few hours later, over a different longitude entirely, could easily have wiped out a major European or Asian city instead of a stretch of empty forest. We got a small, chilling preview of what a smaller version of this looks like in a populated area back in 2013, when a much smaller object, only about 20 meters wide, exploded in the sky above the city of Chelyabinsk, also in Russia. That blast, thousands of times weaker than Tunguska, still injured over 1,500 people, mostly from shattered glass, and was caught on hundreds of dashcam videos, giving scientists their first clear, modern footage of an airburst event in real time. Researchers studying Chelyabinsk immediately drew direct comparisons to Tunguska, using the smaller, well-documented event to help calibrate exactly how much bigger and more destructive the 1908 explosion over Siberia truly must have been. Today, the Tunguska site sits within a protected nature reserve, largely returned to healthy forest after more than a century of steady regrowth, visited only occasionally by small teams of researchers retracing Kulik's original path into the wilderness, and by the rare adventurous traveler drawn by the mystery itself. The Evenki communities who lived through the event, and whose ancestors witnessed it firsthand from a distance, passed their accounts down orally through generations, long before Kulik's team ever arrived to formally document any of it, an oral history that turned out, once scientists finally sat down and listened carefully, to be remarkably accurate in nearly every detail, right down to the color and direction of the light. The event fundamentally changed how seriously the global scientific community takes the ongoing threat posed by near-Earth objects. It's a major part of why space agencies around the world now actively track thousands of asteroids that could pose a future danger to Earth, funding dedicated survey and detection programs, specifically because of what Tunguska proved was possible in the first place, decades before anyone had a telescope capable of spotting such objects in advance. And it's why the phrase Tunguska-sized event has become the standard benchmark scientists still use today when discussing the real-world risk of a city-ending impact arriving without warning from the sky, a unit of measurement born entirely out of one unexplained, terrifying morning in 1908. Some researchers have even proposed sending modern drone surveys and ground-penetrating radar teams back to the site in the coming years, using technology Kulik could never have dreamed of, in one more attempt to finally settle the debate once and for all. So far, funding and the sheer remoteness of the location have kept those plans mostly on paper, and the forest continues to guard whatever secret it still holds. More than a century later, the forest at Tunguska has grown back, green and quiet now, where it was once violently flattened and burning for miles in every direction. But the underlying question of exactly what tore through the sky that June morning, with enough force to flatten a landscape the size of a major city, and then vanish afterward without leaving behind a single confirmed physical trace, has never been fully, completely answered, and it may never be. If an explosion that powerful can happen without leaving a single solid trace behind for anyone to find, imagine a disaster caused not by something falling from the sky without warning, but by a slow, quiet mistake made entirely by human hands, deep underground over the course of years. Subscribe because next time, we're covering a fire that has been burning steadily beneath an entire town for more than 60 years, and still, to this day, hasn't gone out.